friend and colleague from the East Bay, Congresswoman Lee, such an inspiration and a pleasure to work with. Also want to thank the professor and thank to everyone, all of you for joining. We have over 600 people, I'm told, joining us for this town hall. So we want to get to your questions and the presentation. This is a very, very important subject, and it's frustrating for many of us, having heard testimony when we passed the bill out of the Rules Committee and the floor. It's frustrating to not want to collectively focus on how do we get Americans to legally be able to vote and make it as convenient and easy as possible, so we have the most vibrant democracy as possible, and still ensure that everyone knows that these votes are done legally. So it's frustrating right now, the atmosphere, and to be honest, it's hard to understand some of my colleagues and their logic. So I'll leave it there. Look forward to the conversations and the questions. Congresswoman Lee.
Thank you very much. Really good to be with you once again, Congressman DeSaulnier, in your county, Contra Costa County, and really happy to see our professor and Chanel and everyone who's with us tonight to talk about how we protect our democracy, because voting is so central to our democracy. And last month, of course, we witnessed the voting rights legislation, the Freedom to Vote Act, and the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act. We saw that blocked by really an arcane, undemocratic Senate procedural rule, the filibuster. And in doing so, those senators who voted against considering that legislation has made it very clear that access to the ballot box isn't guaranteed, and voting is a right, and they're saying it's only for some. 16 members, I have to remind you now, of the Senate who are Republicans, they supported the Voting Rights Act of 2006. I was there at the White House when George W. Bush signed it into law. They are still now in the Senate and refuse to vote for it. Outrageous. It doesn't make any sense. So make no mistake. These attacks on the right to vote, they really are attacks on the rights of communities of color, young people, elderly people, people with disabilities, people who live in rural communities, and other vulnerable communities. But if they're coming for me today, they're coming for you tomorrow. And so we have to remember that this is about our democracy and protecting our democracy. Now, I lived through Jim Crow. I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas, when poll taxes were still being collected before the Voting Rights Act was passed. So we can't go back there. We can't turn that clock back. Everyone deserves equal access to the ballot box and to have their voices heard. And so finally, I'll just say, as chair of the Subcommittee on Appropriations of State and Foreign Operations and the former member of the Foreign Affairs Committee on Election and work at the UN, I've been an election observer all over the world. I know the importance of fair and free elections and how it strengthens the democracy. And I know the tests that we use. I know the criteria we use to certify elections as fair and free. It was kind of hard now to go around the world to talk about fair and free elections, because we're witnessing right here in America a coordinated assault on the integrity of our election process. So believe you me, we need to live up to our own ideals and stand as an example for other countries to follow, because right now that's questionable. It would be very hard to observe elections now, given what is taking place in our own country, because it's not what people expected out of America. And so we've got to strengthen our democracy by making sure these bills pass and by making sure that people understand that voting rights is essential to maintaining a strong democracy. So thank you all again.
Thank you, Congresswoman Lee. Before introducing our professor from UC Berkeley, we're going to go into our PowerPoint presentation here. All right, Congressman, can you see that on your screen?
I can see it.
Congressman DeSaulnier, you're on mute.
You didn't hear me say my technology liabilities were not being demonstrated, and there I was on mute. So thank you. We just wanted to present these, excuse me, the short PowerPoint for all of you who are tuned in here, just sort of look at the facts that Congresswoman Lee and I just talked about, and the professor will give us some of his research as well and his background. But this is not a subtle thing that's happening in this country. And I must say, it is really quite alarming and frustrating. I think as I said before, and as Congresswoman Lee said, in a vibrant democracy, we all get to vote. We have a vibrant debate. We have disagreements. We respect disagreements and different perspectives, but the rule of law is supposed to always be respected. So seeing these laws being passed that, to my view, are quite deliberate to inhibit Americans from being able to vote. And as Congresswoman Lee said, we have to acknowledge the harsh history of this country, that particularly in regards to lower income, disadvantaged communities of color, that's part of our history. And unfortunately, it's still part of our history from my perspective. So we just want to present this. We can go, I think we've got one more, Chanel, that gives you the number of laws that are being passed and at the state level. And we've got issues at the local level and trying to intimidate election officials that are also troubling. But the voting, this particularly voting rights bill that Congressman Sarbanes, our wonderful lead on this from Maryland, has really been quite dogged about getting it through the House. And then he's continued to be quite persistent with his partners and his co-sponsors to get the votes in the Senate. So we haven't succeeded yet, but we're going to keep working at it. And these are the three specific bills that Congresswoman Lee mentioned, and I mentioned Mr. Sarbanes, his leadership, but of course, our wonderful friend and inspiration, our former colleague, John Lewis, is appropriate that he's named as one of these bills are named for him, and two of them, all three of them actually are a lot of his leadership and his inspiration, his life experience is part of our efforts.
All right. Thank you, Congressman DeSaulnier. Next, we'll introduce, we are joined today by UC Berkeley professor Eric Schickler. Schickler is an author of several award-winning books, including Filibuster, Extraction, and Lawmaking in the United States Senate. Professor Schickler, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you tonight on this really critical issue. I guess I want to start by talking just a little bit about why this attack on voting rights is happening now, or putting it in a historical context. I think it's important to emphasize the United States has really only been a genuine multiracial democracy with full voting rights for essentially all of its citizens for fewer than 60 years. Really, the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 is transformational in that way. And I think what we are seeing in the past several years is a reaction by many against what that multiracial democracy has meant in practice in terms of changes in power and representation in our society. So these voting laws started to take off after Barack Obama was elected in 2008, and then were supercharged with President Trump's real essential direct appeals to white racial resentment against changes in US politics and society starting in 2016. And although the new laws don't mention race explicitly, it's clear that the laws have a disproportionate impact on people of color, since, for example, if you think about voter ID laws, communities of color tend to have lower rates of having, for example, when it's a restrictive law in terms of photo ID forms that are accepted. And also the laws have often targeted turnout strategies such as early voting that have been particularly effective in raising minority turnout. I think it's also worth noting that the arguments about voter fraud that have been used to justify a lot of these laws have real eerie parallels to the post-Civil War era, when we saw white Southerners use a series of laws to shut out Black voters in the South, and several Northern states passed tough registration laws that made it harder for immigrants to vote. And in both cases, the claim made was that they were securing elections from fraud. But really what we were seeing was a backlash against expanding who has power and representation in American society. That's one reason. The second reason it's happening now is really a change in the Supreme Court. We saw that especially with the overturning of a major part of the Voting Rights Act with Shelby County decision, where the court really signaled it wouldn't stand in the way of laws that make it harder to vote. And I think when we think about this, one thing that's worth emphasizing is that the Constitution itself doesn't include an explicit guarantee of a right to vote. But after the Civil War, when the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment were passed, they were really intended to essentially create that right or make it much harder to limit the right to vote. And in the aftermath of that, unfortunately, we saw the Supreme Court in the late 19th century interpret those amendments in ways that allowed for voter suppression. And so I think a concern many people have is that the court today is again allowing that to happen. All right, so then you might ask, well, what's the impact of these laws? What do they mean in practice? I think it's important to think about both their direct effects and their indirect effects. So in terms of direct effects, the common feature of these laws is that they raise the cost of voting in terms of the time it takes, the resources needed to figure out what you need to do to cast a valid ballot, also making it harder to help other people to vote. So basically making it harder to get other people to the polls. Now, there's a lot of debate in political science about exactly how much does this hurt voter turnout. And one of the findings that has emerged is there have been at least a few cases where the laws have actually backfired because they've spurred outrage that led to intense mobilization by people. But the problem is it's hard to sustain outrage as a strategy over time, right? And in any case, even when there is this backlash, what you're doing is forcing activists to devote their resources to help people navigate the laws rather than reaching out to new voters. And so I think it's pretty clear from the political science research that it's certainly in close races, these laws are going to be enough to tip the outcome. And even when it doesn't impact the outcome, it's a real problem, I think, to impose a tax on people for voting. Congresswoman Lee referred to the poll tax. You can think about this as a de facto tax in that way that's targeting especially vulnerable communities. Those are the direct effects. I want to speak just real briefly about the indirect effects, because I think those are in some sense even more worrisome, because these laws are part of a broader project that we've really seen take off in the last few years, spearheaded by President Trump, former President Trump, to delegitimate elections that his party loses. So these laws come from the same place that led to the baseless claims of fraud in 2020 and are part of an attack on the integrity of elections that many of us worry are going to lead some state legislatures to try to award the electoral votes in 2024 or future election to the candidate with fewer votes. And I think it's really important to emphasize this was something we just weren't worried about or didn't have to think about as recently as 8 or 10 years ago. But many of us are worried that if the election comes down to 1 or 2 states, that partisan election officials and legislators are going to try to essentially steal the outcome. So we're really in a moment when multiracial democracy is under real threat, and both in terms of making it harder to vote and making it less clear that the votes once cast will be respected in shaping the outcome. So political scientists who have never been particularly eager to engage in debate about particular legislation, this is not our job, this is not how we see ourselves, have taken notice of this situation and spoken about the need for some action to take place. And so just last point real quick, as the congressman noted, this bill, the legislation that's passed the House has been hung up in a Senate filibuster and obstruction. And to actually pass the legislation, there's going to need to be, due to unified Republican opposition, changes in Senate rules regarding to the filibuster. This is something I've done research on and written about in the past, and I'm not going to talk about it now because I think my time is up, but if there are questions, I'd be glad to talk about what the process would look like for reform. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Schickler. We will now move into our question and answer section of the town hall. As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Our first question comes from John from Concord. What do you feel is the biggest threat to voting rights in this country? Congressman DeSaulnier, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. From my perspective, I, as I said in my opening, I don't, it's frustrating for me and I don't fully understand it. And I'm not naive about our history and the challenges we have. And I certainly appreciate and respect Congresswoman Lee's perspective and her life experience. But we shouldn't be afraid of everyone participating. What we've learned in this country in the last 60 years is it makes us stronger. So different perspectives, in my view, by voters and their representatives, so more diverse electorate and their representatives in Congress and city councils, school boards, and state legislatures pass laws that are more reflective of everybody's life experience. That's what we're trying to do. I was proud to be an author of a vote by mail project when I was in the legislature. Alex Padilla, now senator, was one of my partners in that. And we modeled it after years in Oregon. The professors probably looked at that. Made it easier for people to vote. Also, some of the research, as I understand, made people more thoughtful. When you've got a big ballot, you've got a lot of ballot arguments, particularly in a state like California. So that it's not so much, it's making it easier for people to vote and having confidence and faith that people will make the right decision, and having everyone have that opportunity makes for a better country and better laws that are more reflective of everyone.
You know, I think that voter suppression really is a crisis right now that's at its boiling point. And the Republicans continue to push incendiary lies and conspiracy theories aimed at depressing voter turnout. And so what's happening is they're sowing the mistrust in our elections from the highest levels. That is a crisis that we have to really face, because a lot of people are believing the big lie. And once you believe that big lie, then in fact, you engage in tactics to suppress the vote. And that will backfire, I think, on them. But right now, that's a huge crisis in terms of voter suppression. And finally, I'll just say, when you look at certain states now that have passed laws where you can't even drink a glass of water in a line. And these are lines in rural communities and in Black communities where people have to wait. I was down in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, and then waiting 8-9 hours not to be able to have a glass of water. I mean, that is barbaric, if you ask me. It's vicious, it's violent, and it's wrong. And this is what's happening all over the country to intimidate voters so that they feel that they need to go on and go home, and that their vote's not going to count, nor that they'll have a chance to vote because of external circumstances, like having to get back to their job. So it's a big problem, voter suppression, and what they're doing to suppress the vote and sowing the mistrust.
Thank you both. Our next question comes from Alan from Orinda. Given the need for 60 votes and currently only having 48, what realistic hopes do you have of protecting the rights of voters across the country?
Well, people have to participate, and part of, I think, the strategy by people who don't want everyone to vote is to have people give up, quite frankly, and not trust the system. So for those of us who do trust and have faith in the system and openness in the voters, we just have to keep working at it, knowing that we've got structural, systematic problems in our rules, particularly in the Senate, that were set up to make it hard, in my view, for people of color in particular, and for majority rule to prevail.
I want to hear the professor's plan as it relates to what he laid out about the filibuster. But for me personally, we need to get rid of the filibuster. It's a procedure from the Jim Crow era, and I think Senator Schumer did the right thing by calling for a vote so we could see who's on the right side of justice. But I'll kick it to Professor.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think it is important to emphasize that the target right now is, or the realistic target for change isn't really 60 votes anymore, because there aren't going to be 60 votes given the kind of, for this kind of major legislation that really addresses the voting rights crisis. The target is 50 votes, and 50 votes plus a tiebreaker from the vice president to alter the Senate rules. And I think the important thing to note about the filibuster is that until relatively recently, the filibuster was actually rarely used to kill legislation. It was not, there's this mythology that it always took 2/3 or 60 votes or supermajority support to pass bills in the Senate. And that's just not right. It was routine in the 19th century, for example, in early 20th century, for bills to pass with just a simple majority over intense minority opposition. And unfortunately, if you look at what was it that was killed by the filibuster throughout much of American history, it tended to be legislation to expand civil rights. First in opposition to slavery, and then in terms of safeguarding the rights of Black Americans in the South and throughout the country. And the reason that it succeeded in those years, though, wasn't because you could always kill legislation. It was because there was an intense minority of Southern Democrats in control that had enough votes, and they cared about the issue much more, unfortunately, than Northern supporters of civil rights. And what really changes in the 1960s due to movement activism is you finally get the intensity in support of civil rights to overcome that obstruction, right? And so what's happened recently is a kind of transformation of the filibuster where it's now is used all the time to kill legislation. But that's really new. And the problem is that that kind of system makes it just incredibly difficult to govern when you have two highly polarized parties of relatively equal strength. And so I think what we're seeing is increased efforts to kind of get carve-outs from the filibuster, limit the filibuster. So we saw majorities do that in order to get judges confirmed, first by the Democrats in 2013 and expanded by the Republicans in 2017. And to do that, all you need is a majority in the Senate. A majority is able to essentially reinterpret the rules and declare, for example, that when it comes to voting rights legislation, for example, because the Constitution, because that's a fundamental constitutional right, it will only take 50 votes to end debate. So you can do that. The obstacle right now is the Democrats are 2 votes short from that. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I'd say from an optimistic standpoint, a few years ago, they were more like a dozen votes short of that. There were and so what's happened in recent years is a whole lot of Democratic senators have been persuaded they need to take this action. Does not appear that Senators Sinema or Manchin are persuadable, certainly at the moment, unfortunately. So but really the target is electing a few more senators. That's what's going to be decisive to change this, I think.
Thank you, Professor. Our next question is Nora from Oakland. What can President Biden do to protect voting rights now that the voting rights bill has been voted down? Can the Department of Justice do anything to combat state voter suppression laws?
Barbara, I'll let you go. That's your constituent.
Well, right now, President Biden, he's doing everything that he can do as the president to protect our constitutional right to vote. For example, with regard to the Department of Justice, they're examining all of these available options to protect voting rights and to stop voter suppression. The Department of Justice, it's laid out a plan to increase enforcement, and it's willing and able, and it is challenging voter suppression laws around the country. And I think lately you've seen just last month, the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Texas because of the state's new redistricting plans that they discriminate against Black and Latinx voters. And so the Justice Department, I believe that President Biden, the Justice Department is doing everything they can do. They have every tool in their toolbox that they have pulled out, but you have to have a law for pre-clearance and because the Shelby case really knocked out the essence of the Voting Rights Act. And so that's what we have to do. But I think that the administration is doing everything they can do to address voter suppression around the country, and especially challenging these states that have gerrymandered their congressional districts, which are just blatantly discriminatory and racist.
Thank you, Congresswoman Lee. Our next question is from Leslie from Zoom. What can be done to preserve the United States Postal Service and vote by mail? The United States Postal Service has been under attack for quite some time now. There are laws against mail tampering. How can we enact laws against tampering with the mail service?
Well, we've had some hearings in the Committee of Jurisdiction of the Postal Service in the Oversight Committee, including calling the Postmaster General DeGioia in. There's really some troubling reports from the Inspector General on just the thing we brought up. So we've got to stay on it. There's a number of bills that have come out of oversight. And at least to begin with, they were bipartisan, but again, they've started to change. So it's not just voting rights, in my view. The previous administration was trying to undermine the census process and the delivery of mail ballots. So all of these things, to me, are quite obviously directed at suppressing votes. So we've just got to stay on it. And we do have a number of bills that we've passed out of the House to help the Postal Service, and we're continuing to hold the Postmaster General as accountable as we can be, and putting a lot of pressure and oversight and transparency on that. But it's another example of, it's not just the voting rights, it's the infrastructure, whether it's the Commerce Department and the census collection, which we had hearings on and had Secretary Ross come, and the efficiency of and the integrity of the Postal Service.
Yeah, and during the last elections, if you remember, we had post offices mailboxes that were moved, shut down. People went to mail their ballots. We had to, in my district, had to really call them on the carpet to get these mailboxes put back on the corners where they had been. So personally, DeGioia's got to go, I think, sooner or later. This effort to privatize the Postal Service is what's behind all of this. And I think that sooner or later, we're going to have, the president's going to have to, do what he needs to do.
Thank you both. Our next question is from Emily from Zoom. What about reform of the Electoral College Act? Professor, would you like to start this one?
Sure. So that is one of the danger points, because that was it was through the Electoral Count Act, or kind of loopholes in that act, that former President Trump was essentially trying to get Vice President Pence to claim discretion under the act to reject particular electoral votes. And that was not something that's really intended under that law, but there is an effort, and this is one of the few efforts that at least has some bipartisan support, to try to clarify or tighten the act to make it clear the vice president's role is purely ceremonial, for example, and to require more objections. Right now, it's extreme. One House member, one senator together can object. So to raise the threshold for objections. One limitation, though, is that at least the reform bills under consideration, or the ones that seem like they could get Republican support, aren't going to target some of the bigger dangers, I think, or which are, for example, if a state legislature decides that they don't like the result of an election and try to send off and say retroactively, well, we're going to certify a different set of electors. And if the governor goes along in a state, there's a risk of that happening right now. And it certainly is possible to reform the act to prevent that. But one of the things to watch is whether it's possible to get the necessary support to not only, for example, limit the vice president's discretion, but also make it less likely that partisan election officials or legislators in a state will try to overturn the result of the counted votes in that state.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm looking at this bill now, because it doesn't address necessarily access to the ballot box and voter suppression, but we see what's taking place now, what took place in the 6 or 7 states with these fraudulent electors who were trying to designate themselves as, and signing documents, fraudulent documents, trying to make sure that they were the ones who were the electors for the state. So hopefully the penalties are enough that this can't happen again. But I hope that in this new legislation that if there are gaps and loopholes, that we close those loopholes. Because can you imagine Democrats or Republicans coming in saying, if my candidate does not win, I want you to be the elector, I want you to be the elector. These people need to go to jail. So I hope the investigation and I hope the penalties for doing what they did are such that it's a criminal offense. And if not, this new bill should make it a criminal offense.
Yeah, I'm hopeful, but I've been hopeful before, but I'm hoping that some of our more reasonable colleagues across the aisle don't want January 6th to happen again. So that's the hope. And I've heard some good discussions of that. I'm reading our wonderful colleague and constitutional expert, Jamie Raskin's book. And it's telling from his perspective constitutionally in this regard and what happened on January 6th and what they were what our side was anticipating that they might do given the loopholes, but then also underestimating how diabolical people were going to be in that regard. So I'm hopeful that we'll have a bill that will pass that will help clarify the roles and functions of the Electoral College, at least that day. In my view, we should get rid of it. It just should be a simple majority vote. I know Barbara feels the same way.
Thank you. Our next question is from OG. Congresswoman Lee, Congressman DeSaulnier, have you had the opportunity to speak with senators who voted in favor of the Voting Rights Act in 2006 to see what it would take for them to support the Voting Rights Act now?
I haven't spoken with them at all, but I know some of my colleagues in the Senate have, but I haven't directly spoken to them.
I haven't either.
All right, thank you both. Paula from Pleasant Hill, what is being done to combat gerrymandering?
Well, Paula, we've got independent commissions. The former Attorney General, Eric Holder, has put a lot of work into this, and we're learning. Every state's got a little variation, but generally they've done a really good job. So that's one way to do it. And I'd be interested to hear what the professor has to say, given his history.
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly is evidence that independent commissions tend to reduce partisan gerrymandering, and if the guidance is good to the commissions, which I think in California it has been pretty successful, they've often enhanced competition, which I think a lot of folks would say is a good thing. I think one of the tricky things now is that if it tends to be the case that commissions now are much more common in blue states, Democratic-leaning states, than in red states, Republican-leaning states. And so the kind of net result is that we get more, Democrats, when they're in power, will do gerrymandering just like Republicans will do it. They won't do it with some of the same, the points about race that Congresswoman Lee raised, it won't be the same, but in terms of party advantage, both parties try to do it. But if one party is able to gerrymander in its states, and then the other party isn't, that kind of adds to a kind of unlevel playing field. So one thing we're seeing this year is Democrats, where they do have control, and it's not and it's not an independent commission like New York, are being pretty aggressive. And maybe the hope is ultimately if both parties see that there isn't really an advantage for one party, maybe that allows a more kind of national solution that levels the.
Yeah, in the Freedom to Vote Act, which again was For the People Act, which we passed in the House twice, which Senator Manchin revised and amended and changed the name of, and thought he could get 10 senators to vote for it, and they wouldn't even vote to give it a debate, to let it come up for a debate, which was totally, I can't even tell you how furious I was about that. So we did change the provisions of the For the People Act. We did give it to Senator Manchin. He did change the name of it. He did try to get, based on that, committed to the 10 Republicans, and then they bailed. But in the Freedom to Vote Act, For the People Act, we had strict provisions as it relates to gerrymandering. We had federal criteria, and we had a framework for independent commission, depending on the state and what have you. Now, because we did not pass that bill, thanks to our friends, the 16 Republicans and the 2 Democrats, what I mentioned earlier in terms of the Department of Justice, they're going after these blatantly gerrymandered districts throughout the country. So right now, we're going to see a lot of lawsuits being filed until we can figure this out in terms of the legislation, because it clearly is a partisan effort, both Democrats and Republicans, but it's clearly very sinister this year in terms of you layer voter suppression laws on top of the blatantly racist gerrymandering around the country. The Justice Department has got to be very aggressive in these lawsuits.
We have a ton of questions rolling in. We're gonna pull one from Facebook, from Karen. I received a mail-in ballot from someone who is not at my address. Who is auditing the voter rolls and addresses? People who have moved out of state are receiving ballots. How can we fix this?
Pastor, you want to start what we do nationally? First thing you should do is you should let the registrar's office know of what's happened for the individual, would be my advice.
Yeah, we also need to let the Secretary of State know. So I think any issues that are coming around in terms of like that, we need to document, we need to let the county voter registrar's office know, and we need to find out what they're going to do about it, and then make sure that the Secretary of State knows what's going, the Secretary, is it Secretary of State? Shirley Weber, yeah, make sure that she knows what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a role for the states in keeping and updating voter rolls, and it can be done in a regular way that's not suppressed, that's not designed to take out valid voters, but is designed to, make sure that people who are no longer in a given place are not on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Professor. Next is Ellen from Walnut Creek. Will the House start piecemealing voting legislation and attach the funding to avoid the filibuster?
Interesting strategy.
Yeah.
I love it. New ideas, new ideas. I have to say, I don't know. I haven't heard that, but I think it's a good idea.
But I'm not sure. This is part of the problem with Build Back Better, right? What will the Senate parliamentarians say is reconciliation?
Yeah.
We still have the filibuster to, as I understand the rules. Professor, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you still have the problem if you separate them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as I understand the question, I think the idea is that if it's must pass legislation, like to keep the government running or say the debt limit, that it's hard to obstruct it essentially, right? You can't fill it, and even if it's not a reconciliation bill, right? Reconciliation, you couldn't put it in because of the parliamentarian, but if it was just say a government funding bill, I think the problem is we've seen that, I think there is a willingness to shut down the government in opposite, my guess is Republicans would still filibuster it in the Senate and then essentially try to blame the Democrats and Biden administration for the problems caused by the shutdown. And, unfortunately, when the politics of these things can be kind of treacherous when you try to use the kind of threat of a shutdown or that we need to keep the government funded to get some other objective met. It tends to be pretty hard to pull that off just as a kind of political matter.
Yeah, well, I always think where there's a will, there's a way, right? So what we did on the debt ceiling, they found a way. And we were able to make sure we lifted the debt ceiling, right? Okay, so we tried the same thing in essence with the voting rights piece. Put the voting rights legislation in the NASA bill, which we thought was a must pass. No dice. So they make it up as we go. And it just, we've got to find a path forward. But these must pass bills, it again is subject to the Republicans, and they will shut down the government and blame, like Professor said, and blame Democrats for doing it. And we saw that with voting rights and how the debt, they didn't threaten to shut the government down. They just didn't vote for it, even with we thought a must pass bill.
Well, that leads into our next question. Carolyn from Zoom. Is it possible to pass any of the voting rights bills by executive action if there is insignificant votes in the Senate?
Very limited, my understanding.
Yeah, very limited, maybe a couple of provisions, but I think they're looking at that. I think the administration is definitely looking at it. But I don't believe that at this point they've come up with an executive order strategy for voting rights.
I think it's hard with the current Supreme Court also. I think there'd be a lot of scrutiny of anything it tries to do.
Excuse me.
Professor, we have a question directed just for you.
Okay.
Has anyone attempted to do a redo of the 2020 election using new parameters inflicted by the Republicans to show Manchin how it would have affected the results, especially if they have been on the ballot?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, there've been prospective studies to think about how, what the likely impact of, say, for example, the restrictive legislation in Georgia that was passed in terms of, potential impacts on turnout there in those very close Senate races. I haven't seen something more globally about 2020, but, I certainly think that's an interesting way to go. I think the other point I'd make about turnout is, ultimately one piece of hope eventually for this, maybe if Republicans figure out that actually, they have a lot of low propensity voters themselves. They have a lot of people who are irregular voters. Many of them were pulled out by Trump to vote. But, even when the laws are targeted in the ways they are, maybe in the long run, there'll be some realization that they're also holding back a lot of their own voters. Maybe that'll lead to some shift, though I'm not optimistic in the short term, to be honest.
Next, Michael from Zoom. What is your opinion of the $421 million that Zuckerberg injected into the last election throughout districts across the country? How should this be prevented moving forward?
Well, let me just say, dark money or not, we got to get money out of politics. And part of the legislation on the Freedom to Vote Act is really addressing dark money and this type of money in politics, because again, got to get to public financing of campaigns, because this is outrageous when people can do that. And or corporations, Citizens United, we got to overturn Citizens United, but the money is corrupting our political system.
Absolutely agree. Barbara Lee speaks for me.
You answered that very quickly, Congressman. All right. Our next question is for Congresswoman Lee. Will you elaborate on the characteristics of a poll tax?
Okay, the characteristics of a poll tax. Let me think about this. You go into a polling place and there's a jar of jelly beans and you're asked to count how many jelly beans are in there. Let me know in 5 minutes how many. Or, these are old time characteristics of what it was like then. Asking you questions that you don't know the answers to, like who have you voted for in the past for District 1? Well, I've never voted before, so I don't know. So trick questions to deny you access to the ballot, questions that no one could answer. And that was there were so many sinister ways in the poll tax that people were denied access to vote, that it was terrible all over the South, especially. And what I worry about now is they're going to come, what's taking place are just new forms of poll taxes. And that's what we have to watch out for, denying certain people access to the ballot box. And that's what happened before 1965. And I know that's what happened in Texas, because the poll tax was alive and real there. And my family and people all over Texas remember how they wanted to vote. They had the right to vote, and you show up and you can't vote because the obstacles were there that weren't so subtle, but you couldn't live up to or meet the criteria for voting.
All right, Mr. Smith from Zoom. How about putting forward the exact wording of the 2006 voting rights that passed and trying to pass it now? Those who voted for it before might have trouble explaining why they would not vote for it now.
I like that idea.
Yeah, but Shelby versus Holder came later, that decision. And that's the decision for pre-clearance. So that if you don't get pre-cleared, then you have the ability to go to court to challenge what's taking place. And so you can't have the same law because Shelby versus Holder hadn't been decided. That's just my quick response on that.
Harpreet from West County. Many new immigrant voters are already nervous about showing up to vote. How are these laws affecting them?
Well, they're affecting them, Harpreet, just in the sense that people are afraid to, I would say, to show up to vote. So some of it's just that blatant. It's just the intimidation, or meant to dissuade people from, as I've said before, we've all said before, in having confidence that your vote matters. Professor, there's a lot of history for intimidating immigrants into this country who are here and legally able to vote in our history, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just policies, historically, part of voter registration laws and things that require you to navigate more bureaucratic processes tends to be for people who weren't born in the United States. It's often hard. They're less familiar with those processes, don't have as many family members to help them navigate. And so just putting obstacles to make it more like a maze as opposed to something where where it's made easy, kind of natural for you to vote.
Yeah, and the intimidation factor is great because some family members may have undocumented relatives, and the intimidation about ICE, and is ICE going to show up and come raid my house and come, I just think it's a real fear that immigrants have, that the ripple effect or the impact of showing up to vote could hurt family members and friends in their neighborhoods. And so we've got to deal with that, I think, in a big way.
And to the degree that we can help our friends and families support people so that they don't feel intimidated, I think are things that we want to partner with you on. So if you hear cases like that, let our offices know. We want to be supportive. And I know there are many people in communities who want to be supportive.
Thank you, Congressman. Our next question is from Paul. Have any of you ever seen our country this close to the possibility of minority rule? So I think what he's trying to say of having a true democracy, of having a minority, which is becoming the majority.
Well, let me just say, I haven't seen this country as close to an autocracy or dictatorial rule as it is now. I mean, you hate to talk about what's next if, in fact, Republicans and Donald Trump had their way and they take over, because he has clearly tendencies, dictatorial tendencies, not embracing democracy at all. And so I worry about how fragile we are right now with so many people following him. There are more of us than them, but they're the ones right now who are trying to change the form of system and government that we have. And that's the danger, I think, in this context, this political context.
Yeah, I'll say for me, it's more than discouraging. Thinking of January 6th, Barbara, that what we all went through there, rereading Jamie's perspective in his book, given what he was going through at that time in his life, his personal tragedy, his understanding of constitutional law and history, as the professor understands as well. So for me, at my age, I have the great honor to be a member of Congress, but it's hard for me to believe. I thought we were making progress. And I always relate to John Powell's comments when we've had him on our town halls, wonderful professor at Cal, who's really a wonderful expert on inclusion and diversity. When we've had these frictions, we get this tension. And it's let go, folks. It's better for everybody if everybody gets an opportunity to express themselves. So
look, Mark, you mentioned January 6th. January 6th was an attempted coup.
Right.
It was an attempt to violently stop the peaceful transfer of power.
Right.
Now, this happens in fascist countries, okay? Right. So if you don't understand that, the context in which January 6th occurred, then we need to dig a little deeper. That's the context. Secondly, white supremacists and domestic terrorism is the top national security threat in this country. We've got to keep that in context when we talk about our political system and minority rule and access to the ballot box. So this is broader, it's bigger than the voting rights. This is the fundamental issues that we have to recognize and face and know what we're dealing with in America right now.
Yeah, and it's really alarming.
Yeah.
We saw it.
Yeah, I was sitting right there on the floor. But you know what? As a Black woman, I tell this story all the time because I've been reading all of these right-wing posts and I knew something was going to go down. Had been all security briefings and we knew that the Capitol had been, we thought, secured. And so I was determined to be there on this historic day. But something, you know, Black people have their antennas up all the time for danger, right? And so I said, because I was on the floor in the Capitol on 9/11 early that morning, and I had on high heel shoes, and it was hard when they told us a plane might be coming in to evacuate with high heel shoes to run up Pennsylvania Avenue. So I said, with my antennas up, I said, wear your tennis shoes today, because you know something's gonna go down. You don't know what it is, but wear them. I wore my tennis shoes that day, knowing, didn't expect this, but knowing that the deal, something was gonna go down that wasn't gonna be good for the country. And that's what happened. And so that's the context in which Black people live with all the time. And it's really a danger where we are. And that's why we've got to have hope that we can vote, that we can beat back, resist all this that they're doing right now, because it's really about preserving our democracy.
Right.
Professor, is there anything you want to add to this question?
I mean, I think in terms of thinking about historically, I mean, one sort of data point is when we teach, you know, as a political scientist, when I teach Introduction to American Politics, up until a couple of years ago, the stability of American democracy was not something that was kind of that we worried about or taught. You know, the peaceful transfer of power was something we took for granted. It's no longer the case. I mean, anytime when you're teaching about this, you have to talk about what are the points of fragility in our democracy. And, you know, that is something that one might have had to do in 1876, but you hadn't had to do really in well over 100 years. And so that's quite scary, I think.
Thank you, Professor. We have time for one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to closing remarks from our panelists. Our last question is from Sue from Zoom. What can we, your constituents, do to ensure our fellow voters do not experience voter suppression in this upcoming election?
Be engaged. Help your neighbors. If you have people in other parts of the country, reach out to them. There's lots of great organizations, both legally and politically, that want to protect everyone's right to vote and not have them be intimidated.
Yeah, I agree. This is a local and statewide and national struggle. So we have to form alliances. We have to help each other. We have to be unified in our efforts and resist what's taking place. But also we have to be proactive and register people to vote, make sure, and organizations are making sure where there are voter suppression laws, they're making sure they have monitors and they're making sure the lawyers are going to be there. And so that's going to happen on the ground. But in the meantime, we've got to be organized and be ready for whatever, but get engaged. Don't let them win by all of their noise and what they're doing.
So we're going to turn it over to final comments. We're going to start off with the professor.
Thanks so much for including me and for those great questions. I guess the thing I'd just say in closing, maybe 2 quick points. One is that it's important in one sign of that there's a lot of diversity across the country in terms of voting laws right now. And so what we're actually seeing is in some states like California, we've seen real progress in making it easier to vote, right? But I think it's important to not then be complacent about what's going on in other states, because as Congresswoman Lee said, we are all interconnected, and what happens in Georgia or Texas is going to affect folks here as well. And so we need to be attentive both towards what more can we do to expand voting in our own states, but also to what's going on elsewhere. And then the final quick thing I'd say is, thinking about, returning maybe on a point of optimism, which is that the reason this backlash is so intense, I think, is because of the promise of something new happening, change, right? A different kind of government, a government that really is much more broadly representative. And it's going to be a struggle to get to that place. And ideally, maybe folks will over time become less fearful of what that represents, right? What that means to have a government that looks more like the country in its increasing diversity. But that's really, it's resistance to that that's provoking this reaction. But that's also is the thing to hold out hope for and to work toward through this legislation.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Dr. King tonight. He said, change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And that's what we have to do. And again, speaking as a woman, as a Black woman, it's a constant, continuous struggle. And so we cannot get frustrated. We cannot get desperate about where we are. We cannot feel that there's nothing we can do because we can. John Lewis, our beloved colleague, he always said, make good trouble. We've got to make good trouble because the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so whenever I'm in these conversations with people, as hard as it is for Mark and myself, with all the threats we're dealing with everything, we have to make sure that we know and we believe that we're on the right side of history and that we're going to win this fight and we're going to do it together. So thank you all again. You've inspired me. I'm really happy to be able to be part of Mark's town meeting again with so many wonderful people in his district and in Contra Costa County and with Chanel and with the professor. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Oh, Barbara, thank you so much, Congresswoman Lee, and thank you for everything you do, your passion, your tenacity. You're always an inspiration. Professor, thank you so much. We're so proud of the work you do in the University of California. Great, great, great institution.
My alma mater, go Bears.
Yeah.
Go Bears.
Excuse me.
Thanks.
Excuse me.
Sorry, it's okay. Eureka, we found it. With Minerva. So I want to thank you. Thanks, Chanel. Great job. You can do this regularly. We'll give it back to Ryan if he insists, and all of your staff as well, Congresswoman Lee. And I when you mentioned our wonderful former colleague, I thought of his seatmate often on the floor, Elijah Cummings. And when I would sit and listen to him, and he would say, Elijah, before he died away, we're better than this, and we are. And to the professor's call of hope, I am constantly thinking back of John Kennedy's inaugural address, and people always focus on ask not. But the other beautiful quote in that for me and my generation, I think, is few generations get called to defend freedom at its ultimate moment of peril. As much as I can't believe that we're in this moment of peril, it gives me hope that if we get through the couple elections and we believe in truth and honesty and the Constitution, in the spirit of that, we'll be better off. So thank you both for inspiring us, and we just got to stay at it. Thanks, Chanel, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Thanks to my staff also for helping me get here tonight from wherever I was before. They did a great job with helping Chanel coordinate this. Thank you all again. Good evening.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you all. And to our audience, the town hall will be available on our Facebook pages after the event. If you would like to watch it again or share it with your friends, please do not hesitate to contact any one of our offices. And thank you again for joining us this evening. Good night.
Great job.
Bye-bye.